Good evening. We're about 2 hours into jury deliberations right now. So I'm Grace King here with my colleague John North, and we just want to walk you through some of what we've seen this week for the two Knoxville teenagers accused of murdering Stanley Freeman Jr. Now, those teens are 16-year-old Rashawn Jordan and 18-year-old DeAndre Davis. We've heard from 20 witnesses this week. We've seen more than 400 pieces of evidence. And now the jurors are going to have to weigh all of that as they get ready to make their verdict.
It's going to be interesting to see what, really matters for them, Grace. It's a mostly circumstantial case. We didn't have but one eyewitness, and that was a person. The jury doesn't know it, but that young man is dead. He gave his testimony 2 years ago, and they used recording of it today and played it for the jury during this trial. So they've got a lot of technical stuff to think about, what was taken from cell phones and thinking about ballistics evidence, and we don't have a whole lot of DNA. In fact, we've got none.
For sure. And Stanley Freeman, he was 16 at the time of his murder. He was leaving high school. His parents, you can see him running out of the building. He was going home to change to get to work when he was driving down and he was shot and killed. Now, the prosecution's theory is that these two kids were driving in a blue Nissan earlier in the day, got in some kind of altercation with a car that looked just like Stanley's. They don't think he was the intended victim here, and that's something we heard a lot about.
Kind of shocking to realize that this was really just according to the prosecution, he happened to be the one who they thought maybe they wanted to take some action against. As you say, it had only been a few minutes, I think. School was still in session. You can see from the Austin East security cameras, these two cars, one being the blue Nissan and another, just another Honda, was not Stan's. It actually didn't look too much like his. There was some kind of an odd altercation because somebody leaned out of the Honda and was gesticulating, and then minutes later, evidently that must have offended the people in the blue Nissan. Minutes later, they are still trolling around outside. That blue Nissan is. They see Stan's car, and that's it.
And that's where a lot of the discussion and closing arguments came today. It's for first-degree murder. They were saying that premeditation part. Was that enough to kind of premeditate this crime? And that's one of the things the jurors are going to have to take under consideration.
My hunch is, and I could be wrong, but my hunch is they won't struggle over that one, premeditation, because it doesn't take a whole lot to form intent, and you could start from them sitting in the line, having decided they were going to wait and see about this other Honda that they'd seen. Plus, there's also Stan drives off, they take off, they turn the corner. There are plenty of moments there to form premeditation. The state certainly argued that. I don't think they'll struggle with that.
Right. And I think a lot of what we heard about was circumstantial evidence. A lot of that comes from those cell phones. They were looking at some of the cell towers that kind of placed them more or less in the area of the shooting at the time it happened, kind of following them around. We learned a lot about that this week.
Yeah, I learned a whole lot. One, can be your friend or your foe because it will tattle on you plenty. But yeah, I mean, you and I talked about this last week when we were getting prepared for trial, that cell phone evidence would be a big deal. That point had been brought home to me because I watched, and maybe some of you all did, the Alec Murdaugh case, and that was enormous because in that trial they tracked where Alec's cell phone was, and they tracked where the cell phones went for Maggie and Paul, when they were on, when they were off, when they received information, when they were moved. They counted steps. These things can count steps, by the way. If you move, this thing can count steps. So we knew sort of going in that this could be relevant, and my gosh, Grace, it turned out to be profound.
Right. I mean, that's one of the main pieces of evidence, placing them at the scene of the time of the crime. It can show when they connected to the car alleged to be used in this incident. It just showed so much from really all of it, and also what was found on their phones in terms of the photos and videos. It showed the two teens with the guns that they say are the murder weapons before, at the time, or around the time of and after the shooting is what the prosecution was saying. And it also had a number of pictures of Stanley Freeman himself after the murder.
Yeah, I want to get to that point in a sec, but let me just underscore for people who maybe don't realize this. This can track where you're going because of because of what it's storing, and then also your cell service provider retains that information. So we heard from two different ways that information for these two cell phones that the young men are alleged to have been carrying, it was tracking. I mentioned that Alec Murdaugh case. One of the FBI agents who testified in that case, who's an expert at tracking this kind of stuff, through cell phone service. He testified this week. He testified yesterday. You and I were sitting there taking notes hurriedly, and we both sort of realized, wow, we've got Matthew Wild from the FBI testifying right now, and he was just at the Murdoch case. But getting back to your point, lots of pictures, for example, things that were deliberately saved to the iPhones. And one that struck me, and I don't know about you, but one of the things that struck me was that after the shooting and after Stan Reckton died, the cell phones for these two guys allegedly began accruing images of Stan, including a screen grab that was sent to them of Stan, his body in the wreckage. He was still alive at that point. Somebody had gone and made a live social video of the wreckage from outside their home and was showing it. Somebody else saw that, took a screen grab, and sent it to one of these two defendants.
There was a number of things saved. There was the crime scene. There was a post that Stanley's math teacher, she was one of the last people that had spoken with him, just talking about what had happened to him and how tragic it was. That was saved. A screenshot of that was saved to the phones. There were some pictures saved of people saying, you know, rest in peace, Stanley, of the front page newspaper clipping of that incident. And Stanley's father testified saying he has no knowledge of any kind of relationship between the defendants and Stanley. And that was something that everyone kept making clear, is there's really no other reason there, because they had no relation to each other or didn't even know of each other.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. The state says essentially that Stan was an innocent victim, that these two guys didn't know him. Neither of them attended Austin East. One attended Gibbs. The other had been sort of in the feeder system from middle school, but he started blowing off school in middle school, and he never attended Austin East. So yeah, they really didn't know this man, but the state would allege that it didn't matter. They just had decided that, perhaps rightly or wrongly, they perceived that that person in the car had dissed them, and they were going to go after them.
For sure. And one thing you mentioned earlier is DNA evidence used to kind of be that smoking gun in cases before. In this case, it's really not.
It's kind of interesting. So I've been doing this a while, and I can tell you that I remember back in the 90s when DNA was like, ooh, that's the big deal. OJ trial was big. DNA, that's when the forensic testimony regarding genetic material really sort of became prominent in courts and became kind of the standard measure of, well, does the prosecution have DNA in this case? We've gone far beyond that, folks. It's almost, one could argue, you could put a case on and not really use it because, as you alluded, lots of material was collected from the blue Nissan, where you might expect to find some, from some clothing, from other items, and there was the guns. There was so much, it turned out, multiple samples of DNA on key things like the two weapons, that they couldn't make a discernment as to who it was. They said, well, for example, we think there are at least 4 people handled this gun handle, this grip, and that's all they could do. So for this trial, DNA was not a factor.
Cell phone evidence certainly was, as are some of these testimonies that we've heard over the last couple days. Any final thoughts before we kind of let it go for the night?
Well, first of all, I always, when I cover a trial, I appreciate how our government works and how this branch of government works, and it is so important that we go through this process, that the defendants have the benefit of the process, and I think this was a fair trial. I didn't see anything that's kind of screamed out at me as like, oh, that's a huge glaring mistake. Also good for the prosecution because, you know, it is the will of the people that when somebody is alleged to have committed a crime that they're prosecuted. These things are also kind of exhausting after a while. I don't know about you, but it's Friday, and I'd like to get this wrapped up if possible tonight. But I also just want to say, and you and I have seen the families of both the defendants and the victims, and I just want to say that my heart goes out to the family of Stanley Freeman, because here's a young man, 16, who the prosecution described as a young man in a hurry trying to do everything right, did nothing wrong, and his life was taken from him.
For sure. I mean, we heard from his teacher, we heard from his family, and we've talked to the family before, and his basketball coach, he loved playing sports. He worked hard to keep up his grades so he could keep that car that ended up likely getting him killed. He, just wanted to do everything right and ended up wrong place, wrong time, it seems.
Yeah, well, we'll see if there will be justice for the victim. We'll see.
For sure. Well, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We will let you know when we have that verdict or if jurors will return on Monday, but you can check WBIR.com for everything else you need to know.